Texas State's most well-known alumnus, President Lyndon Baines Johnson, stated in his commencement address at Howard University on June in the year of 1965, he said, "You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by the chains of racism and liberate him, bring him to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others and still justly believe that you have been completely fair." And so we gather here today, not in holy matrimony, but we do come together as a community to acknowledge the truth of our history and its impact on our contemporary problems related to racism. Notice I didn't say problems with race. Race isn't our problem. Black, brown, indigenous, Asian, Arab people don't have a problem. We don't have a problem with our race and our ethnicities. We like what race and ethnicity we are. We don't like the pains and burdens of racism. We must name it. If we do not name the issue, we cannot be empowered to address the issue. Just like any disease, once it's diagnosed, you know what it is. The treatment can then begin. Can you imagine how troubling it would be for you to have a multitude of painful, debilitating symptoms that you have expressed countless times to your doctor, yet she has only a mild curiosity about these symptoms and says, that's interesting. Not sure what that's about. Instead, you'd want your doctor to get busy researching those symptoms and working with you to figure out what needs to be done so she can diagnose the ailment and begin treatment. That's what racism is, and that's what it's like, a disease. The people who have been racialized are not the disease. So we are going to name it and discuss it with some upcoming panel members. So we have a panel of faculty members who will be sharing with us today. Three of the panelists will be discussing questions posed by our moderator. And then I'm sorry if you're getting some feedback. Hold on just a second. I think somebody may have their microphone on. Okay, good, there we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so we have three panelists who are going to be discussing questions related to the issue of racism posed by our moderator. And then we're going to have another faculty member who's going to join us, and that's going to be Dr. Marcus Johnson. And he will be joining for the Q&A portion of the discussion. And I'm really excited to say that we have the very lovely and exemplary professional, Dr. Valerie B. Fleming, who will be serving as the moderator for this panel. Dr. Fleming is professor and chair of the Department of Communication Disorders in the College of Health Professions here at Texas State University. She served, as the 2017-2018 Presidential Fellow. Under her leadership, the department received the 2016 Council for Academic Programs in Communication Sciences and Disorders Diversity Award, and was recently awarded a $1.6 million grant from the United States Health Resources and Services Administration to fund scholarships for disadvantaged graduate students. Her passion for teaching and her interest in the access and utilization of healthcare services for underserved communities spurred her to assist faculty in developing inclusive classroom practices and preparing culturally competent clinicians. I must also add, she is a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. I just had to throw that in. Please welcome Dr. Valerie Fleming and our distinguished panel of faculty members.
I would like to begin today by briefly introducing our distinguished panel guests. Just reading their many accomplishments would take our entire time, so I will be brief. First, we have Dr. Scott Bowman, who is an Associate Professor of Criminal Justice and Special Assistant to the Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at Texas State. Dr. Bowman is author of the edited 2-volume book, Color Behind Bars: Racism in the U.S. Prison System, as well as scholarly work that has been published in Critical Criminology, Criminal Justice Policy Review, Race and Social Problems, and Qualitative Criminal Justice and Criminology. His research interests include critical examinations of juvenile justice system, race, ethnicity, socioeconomics, and the intersectionalities in the criminal justice system, and the role of implicit bias in criminal justice attitudes and decision-making. Next, we have Dr. Manika Brooks. She is an assistant professor of curriculum and instruction. Not only has she been recently tenured and promoted to associate professor, she has also been appointed as the Assistant Dean for Academic Affairs and Student Success in the College of Education. She is the author of the book Transforming Literacy Education for Long-Term English Learners, Recognizing Brilliance in the Undervalued, and she has twice been awarded the Presidential Distinction Award for Excellence in Scholarly and Creative Activities. And last and certainly not least, we have Dr. Dawanna Goldstone, Associate Professor of History and Director of the African American Studies Program. And she is author of the award-winning book, Integrating the 40 Acres, the 50-Year Struggle for Racial Equality at the University of Texas. Dr. Goldstone arrived at Texas State in August 2019 after spending 18 years at Austin Peay State University in Clarksville, Tennessee, where she taught African American literature and coordinated the African American Studies program. She is working on a collection of essays about African American life and culture, tentatively titled Strong, Black, Bitter, and Cold, just like her coffee. Thank you to each of you for being with us today. In 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in Souls of Black Folks, "Herein lie buried many things which, if read with patience, may show the strange meaning of being Black here at the dawning of the 20th century. This meaning is not without interest to you, gentle reader, for the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." And then 58 years later, in 1961, during a radio interview, James Baldwin stated, "To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a state of rage, almost all the time and in one's work. And part of the rage is this: it isn't only what is happening to you, but it's what's happening all around you and all of the time in the face of the most extraordinary and criminal indifference. Indifference of most white people in this country and their ignorance. Now, since this is so, it's a great temptation to simplify the issues under the illusion that if you simplify them enough, people will recognize them. I think this illusion is very dangerous because, in fact, it isn't the way it works. A complex thing can't be made simple. You simply have to try to deal with it in all its complexity and hope to get that complexity across. Now here we are, 59 years after Baldwin's interview, which is 117 years after Du Bois's book was written, and we are still challenged by and struggling with the issue of race in the US, right now, today, 2020. Why are we still struggling with the issue of race after all of these years? Please feel free to jump in, any of you.
It's such a loaded, I think we're all struggling to answer it because we've been living it, and it's hard to quantify it in sort of a, yeah. I'm gonna let Scott go.
Thank you. I think the biggest part of the struggle, I think, has been the illusion that at some point or at various points over the past 108 years, that it's been addressed enough to move forward. I think that whether it is Brown versus the Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act, the election of an African-American president, there are these kind of pivotal moments where, as a nation, I think we look and we say, well, not we, non-folks of color look and say, okay, this has happened, everything from this point moving forward should be better, almost a myth of progress. And so I think that we arrive again in this moment, looking and saying we haven't addressed the sins of the past, we haven't addressed the larger issues, some of which are identical. Obviously in criminal justice, policing and the fundamental function of policing has been exactly the same for, certainly since before slavery, and leading, in an overseer role, throughout history where we find it today. And so I think a big part of it is this this myth of progress, this myth of racial progress that that I think many folks tend to cling to as a justification for silence or for apathy or indifference.
I think that's a really good point, Scott. And I think for years we've been having two separate conversations. I think white people have been having their conversation about how well Black people are doing. Look at Oprah, look at Michael Jordan, look at all these, look at the Obamas. And then Black people, we've been having a separate conversation where even those of us who've, quote, made it, still have to deal with this stuff. And there never seems to be a way for white people to sit and listen and to believe us. And I do think, I'm hopeful, I'm very hopeful that this time white people finally get it. That we have not been making up these stories, that there is this myth of progress. That yes, some of us have managed to get through and to, quote, make it, but it doesn't mean we don't experience racism in the same way that other people do, and that our privilege also often, and I want to say privilege, the privilege of having made it, doesn't mean that we're not going to be targets on campus, in our communities, in the store. But I think that's such a great point about this myth of progress, that I don't think Black people thought there was a myth of progress. No. I think that white people thought, oh, well, they're doing fine. We don't need to help.
I think also one of the reasons it hasn't been, I don't think that everybody understands the way it is such a part of this country. Like every the founding of the country, all the different institutions that are part of this country, to sort of think of that like race and racism and all of these things that are connected to it are fundamental to the founding of the United States and what it means to exist in this country. And so I think that until we see how it's in the genesis of the way the country was built, that it was built on indigenous genocide and it was built through chattel slavery. And if we don't come to terms with those initial things and the way it kind of impacted everything else, then it kind of, you can't have a conversation for change if you're not willing to start with understanding what the situation is. And it's not necessarily limited to race in the United States, like to understand like colonialism and the way that colonialism across a variety of countries that were, colonized by Europe, and the I guess the necessity for anti-Blackness in that colonial project. I think if we can't understand the way this is both, the way race and racism operates in the United States is unique, and then also very similar to the ways that it operates globally, I think that we can't move forward. And so I'm not even sure if if you want to say we, people who exist in the United States, have actually even been struggling with it, right? I think that maybe some people have been struggling with it. Some people are just living their life without attending to it at all. So I think that nothing ever gets, I always tell my students, like, what problem gets solved by not talking about it, right? And so far, the only problem that someone told me once was that if you have a pimple, that maybe if you just kind of ignore it and then not address it, then maybe it'll just go away on its own. But other than that, every other problem that exists in the world, you need to see, well, why is this happening? Where did it start? And then how can we go about fixing it, right? But I don't think that there's actually been a communal struggle to actually address the issues. It's been very one-sided as to what individual groups of people might feel is relevant for them, within their particular, how this impacts them.
Yeah. And I would add to that I think that there have been moments, historical moments, where various groups of folks of color have looked and said, okay, this should be the moment that moves this discussion forward, or this should be the moment that institutes some sort of change, and it just doesn't. I'm also cautiously optimistic about where we go from here, but I was cautiously optimistic when it was Rodney King. Even now in the midst of George Floyd, we can't forget that we're putting children in cages, and we can't forget, that we're forcing semi-sovereign Native American populations to do what we think they should do rather than their own self-protection for things like COVID. And so we have these kind of historical moments when we go, okay, this should be it. This should be the wake-up call. I think to Monica's point, we, as a nation, we just kind of sleep on them. The communities that are experiencing it don't, but those that are, have the privilege of avoiding it, have physically, emotionally, spiritually, the idea of it being their problem, it just continues. And I'm glad to see that this isn't the case now, but there's still a lot of silence.
Yeah, I think and you mentioning COVID is another really good example of how it has disproportionately harmed Black and brown communities. And people are now, hopefully they will see that the reason why so many people who look like us are in harm's way is because of the work that we do in the communities we live in, and that a lot of people don't have the privilege of staying home and working from home. And so hopefully people will continue to have conversations about how to keep everybody safe.
Yeah. And not by accident. And there's a history associated with having people of color in those jobs, in those vulnerable spaces, and so it's not just, hey, it's 2020, Blacks and Latinos have chosen to work those jobs because it's good work or because they care, it's like, no, there's a history, there's a racial and economic history that has produced that kind of dual labor market, and has existed for centuries.
Well, even thinking about the vaccine and, the hope for a vaccine, and I posted on Twitter, I'm not taking a vaccine until rich white people take it. Because I don't trust that it will be safe. That, again, I don't want them using our bodies as guinea pigs. Like, yeah. No. But everyone's all hopeful about a vaccine.
We've done that already.
We've done that already.
Yeah. I think that is the hidden history that, what you all are referencing, right, in terms of the Tuskegee experiments, in terms of the forced sterilization of Puerto Rican women, in terms of, what the United States was doing in Guatemala, all of these histories of how medicine and medical treatments have been tested, and, or even the founder of gynecology and the way that he used Black women's bodies to torture them, right, to have all the so-called medical progress that we have now. All those histories are not taught, right? And so there are populations that exist that don't. There's people who willfully ignore that this happened, right, and refuse to believe that it happened. And I think there's another spectrum of the population that literally does not know that this is the history of this country, that, people always like to say on the internet, well, because science, right? But people don't know the way that science is political, the way science is racialized, the way science is not objective nor neutral. And that is a very specific, curriculum choices, right? So thinking about, this is why we struggle with these things, because the knowledge is hidden from people, or not hidden, is purposely withheld, right? Because there's a conscious decision not to share this information.
Or people just don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I feel like it's because somebody didn't, there's a reason why it's not a part of the history standards, right?
Yeah.
And
right.
People don't know because people who are on governing boards are making decisions on what gets taught and what doesn't.
And then people in the classroom aren't taking the classes where they're going to learn this information.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's not required.
Or it's not required. Yeah.
So let's dig a little deeper. I want to know then, how has this issue impacted you both personally and professionally?
Which issue?
The issue of race. And the struggles we're currently dealing with race, how is that impacting you personally and professionally?
It's like, do you have like 12 hours?
So,
Give
I
us the synopsis, the
So
Cliff Notes
I
version.
I had an incident yesterday, and I was walking my dogs, and I think I had 3 of them. And one of them I just got. So I've had him for about 6 weeks. I'm still not really quite sure of his personality. And the same thing happened to me maybe a month ago, and it was, with the same dog. So I'm walking near Miller Middle School, and I'm on a sidewalk, and I turn and I see a mother and the daughter is on a bike. And so I just keep walking, and then it's very clear that the daughter wants, everyone's expecting me to walk into the street. And so I thought, I have this dog, I don't really know his personality. And so here I am standing in the street, a car has to stop so that this white woman and her white child could go by on the sidewalk. And, and I posted that on Facebook because it reminded me of how often black men had to step off the sidewalk so that white people could go by. And it made me wonder, do white people even think about this? And the same thing happened to me yesterday. One of the construction workers wouldn't walk off the sidewalk. And so I walked into the street. And partly I thought I should have just stayed on the sidewalk and made him walk off. But then I thought, there's this COVID, and then I had to think about my own safety, that I don't need to make a statement. And so anyway, I don't know if white people think about that kind of stuff, whereas I can't separate myself from my skin color, from my gender. And so it's there all the time. I got pulled over by a police officer and I was really scared. Is this going to be it? I go jogging really early in the morning and I see cops and I think there'll be no witnesses if they decide they're going to take me out. And I think now white people are starting to see why so many of us live in fear and why just going out to walk my dogs may not be as safe as it appears to be. That was a long answer. Sorry.
No, it was nice. And I'm gonna piggyback off of that because I think one of the it's going to happen at some point when you realize that you're black, that it's always going to be like that, right? I think one of the challenges though has been this sort of, whether it's your parents or family members or community, you go, well, if I arrive at something, if I accomplish something, then it won't be as bad. It will be, I'll still have moments and I'll still have instances, but it's kind of like the Chris Rock joke that says nobody white would change places with me and I'm rich, right? You look and you go, I've arrived at graduate school. I should be treated different. I've earned a PhD. I should be treated differently. I'm a faculty member that does work in the community. I should be treated different. And that moment never arrives, right? The continued fear of, well, there's a police officer and it's me and I'm by myself, still remains. I'm just sitting here minding my own business. Is somebody going to call the police on me just simply because they're afraid of me, right? Is somebody going to pick a fight with me? Is somebody, any number of things. And I'll say one of the things, and I said this in a different meeting last week, to the specific point of what's going on right now. I said that I'm not a police researcher, but I've been a police scholar since I was 8. Because at 8, I had to learn what the police function was and how those interactions went. And it's not to suggest that I have not had positive interactions with the police, but I've had plenty of negative ones, and they go from 8 until recently, right? And that's not including folks that have called the police because they thought I was suspicious or they thought it was, any number of things. I had the police called on me at the university for a step practice because somebody said they heard gunfire. Rhythmic gunfire, right? And had the university police called on us and they pulled up in numbers and we had no idea what was going on. After that, it was fine, but nobody looked, nobody said, let me at least check before I call the police. And then obviously that was a long time ago, but now to the point of kind of, do they think about this? Are they considering this? It's like, are you considering that you might take someone's life, or you might cost someone their life because of your mistake, because of your implicit bias, because of your fears, because of your irrationality? And I'm not sure that that's the case. But to the original point, it's like breathing. It's like, anything else. It's just, you know that it's a part of you, it's a part of what you do and who you are and how you interact with everyone. And you learn to negotiate it as best possible, knowing that there's no reward at the end of it.
Yeah.
Sorry, another long answer.
I was always the only one, right? So I have I'm very accustomed to just, not being in a very diverse environment. And so I think I've always been very conscious about my race, my identity, how that impacts the way other people perceive me from a very young age. I think of James Baldwin. I think he talked about when he went to school was the first time that he learned that he was different. And like, the school was a very big socialization space to learn negative stuff about yourself. And so for me, like, I've always been very academically successful, but socially, and because I've grown up in very liberal spaces, the kind of, comments that are very racialized that I receive is kind of like, oh, well, you're so articulate, you have such a large vocabulary. And like, I do have a large vocabulary, and I can, and I am, and I do speak well, but when those comments are also loaded as to who gets described in those ways and when and how and why, and do you think I should speak another way? Do you think that I shouldn't use such words? And so there are more kind of subtle things that have always been a part of my life that I'm actually that I grew used to and learned how to navigate at a younger age. So I think race is always a thing that is central to kind of how I see myself. And then professionally, being like, again, the only person, but this time kind of in like a higher, more visible position. Like, my students say, well, you're the first Black professor I ever had, or you're the first Black teacher I've ever had, or you're the first person who's ever talked to me about any of these, issues. And so to think about, for a lot of people, how their interaction with me represents a huge learning curve for them, right? Because it's the first experience they have. And that is a lot of pressure when you think about it, because unlike, the series of white or Latino teachers they may have had before, like, I'm this like unicorn, right? And so the way my actions are interpreted are kind of, I feel it's a lot of pressure, right? Because you have to be very aware of how other people are perceiving you while still maintaining who you are, right?
And then I think about going from this very high-pressured situation that you described, Manica, and then you go into your community or home where that degree doesn't follow you, and someone will follow you in the store because because you fit the description.
Yeah, I think the hardest part of all of that is, like, sometimes it catches you when you're not prepared for it. And so, like, I remember when I first moved to San Marcos, I was at the grocery store and I was just buying some eggs, and this older white woman came up to me and she was like, oh, can I touch your hair? And like, dude, like, I teach about like race and schooling and all this stuff, and I know it's quite like a textbook interaction of objectification, but like how I was raised, like, if someone who's older, like, she's still like in her 70s, like, I don't really say no to older people. So without thinking, I was just like, yes. And then she touched my hair, and then she was like, oh, it feels like a baby doll's hair, and then just like walked off, right?
Wow.
And so like, and then I went home and I was just, like, I went and I told my husband, I started like crying because the worst part of the experience is when you feel like you're complicit in your own victimization, right? Is that like, I know that I let this woman objectify me, I let her use me to, as like a project, an animal in a zoo to do whatever exploration she wanted to. And the thing is, she asked me, right? So like, theoretically, I gave my consent, right? And so I think that sometimes is the hardest thing when you're not aware and then you consent to your own tokenization or victimization. you're complicit in it. And that feeling is just one that's really hard to come to terms to, which is what hurt more than the actual interaction, right?
So why does engaging the issue of race make people so uncomfortable? Do you think?
Do you mean make white people so uncomfortable?
Yeah, why are people so uncomfortable?
It can make me uncomfortable. I mean, it can make me uncomfortable because I don't want to go there. Like, sometimes I only want to go there if I'm getting paid. Or like if I feel like if I'm having a conversation with someone that I know is not a safe space for me, or they might use me for learning, I get uncomfortable because I don't want them to say something racist to me. I don't want to. So like my professional and my personal life are like two different things. Like as a professional, like I'm not uncomfortable. In my personal life, I'm like, where is this conversation going? What are they going to say? And now how am I going to have to respond after they do this, right? And so then I get uncomfortable because I'm like, I just want to be at peace. Just keep your ideas to yourself, you know? But professionally, it's different, I guess.
Yeah, I think, as you're saying it, I think I was okay talking about race in a personal and in a professional way. I don't know, we're supposed to be talking politics, but until Trump got elected. And then people started coming out of the woodworks, and I'm sure they were always there, but he made it acceptable to say really racist things. And so now I've just become so angry. I'll confess, I've become really angry. I thought I'd given some of that up when I got here, but I'm back to being angry again. So I don't mind talking to people about it, but I don't know how safe it is anymore. It doesn't feel safe anymore.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead, Megan.
I would say if it's a conversation with someone I don't know and I don't trust, I'd rather know that they've had, in my personal life, like they've read, they've done work individually with themselves and their friends, and in this context, like I'm not just talking about white people. I'm talking about people of a variety of backgrounds who have not understood their own biases, right? And so in my personal life, and so if you haven't done that work around anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, if you haven't done your work about like dealt with your transphobia, your homophobia, like my personal life, like that's not where I'm at in terms of like teaching people lessons about stuff. Now, as an educator, I'm down for that all the time, right? Like that is what I love to do. Like I love to teach future teachers. I love to teach current teachers. I love to have these conversations. But maybe because I do that at work, at home, I'm like, if you don't have it, we're not.
I just think one of the challenges of it is that most people have never had it. They've had the privilege of never having it. When you look at the makeup of the United States and the majority of folks that live in segregated spaces or remain in segregated spaces, coupled with the kind of physical construction of segregated spaces, the building of freeways, the paths of public transit and things like that, you could have, because and I've taught classes, Monica, where I've said the same thing, where it's like, or somebody has said to me, oh, you're my first African-American professor, you're my, but in many instances it may be, hey, you're the first African-American I've met, and so if you live in a space that's segregated, that is racially homogeneous, you don't have to have those conversations. It's a privilege in kind of saying, I don't have to worry about Mexicans in cages and the LGBTQI community and African Americans and Native Americans and Asian Americans and anybody else other than the people that live in my space, right? And so the biggest challenge with having those conversations is simply that folks are not, I don't think that they realize how little they actually know coming into those conversations. And doing it in a classroom is a privilege. It's a privileged space I revere those opportunities, and doing it in like community presentations and things like that, absolutely. But would I strike up a conversation in the bar? Would I strike up a conversation? No. I mean, because there's too much to teach and there's not enough known. And right or wrong, I don't necessarily blame folks for being uncomfortable. I mean, if I was traveling to China and they wanted to ask me about the various dynasties and the history, I'd be like, I don't know. It's not, I'm not from here. It's not my thing. Now, if I lived there for 100 years and said, I just chose not to know, then I'm kind of displaying my ignorance. But, I don't blame folks, but that's part of the problem is that, whether it is high school education, elementary education, university education, public socialization, the media, the news, newspapers, etc., that just choose to, for lack of a better term, whitewash information. It's like you're not setting up white individuals to have those type of conversations and to succeed in what is actually a multicultural space. And that makes it really, really problematic. And it makes it even more problematic when the response to that is resistance, right? So rather than to learn or rather than to engage, I'm going to resist, or I'm going to keep resisting, or how can we kick more people out of the United States? How can we control more public bodies? How can we get more police in the streets to control those folks so that we can maintain what we maintain, rather than to say, hey, you know what, we're probably better off engaging this, probably should have engaged this a long time ago, to Du Bois' point where you started, and we wouldn't be talking about the 21st century being the same color line as we were the 20th century, or Du Bois referring to the 20th century.
And do you think, Scott, this is kind of and this question for both of you, but how much do you think part of the problem is that white people expect us to take the charge on this conversation about race? And
I think that's a big part of it. And I also think that, but at the same time, I think there's information that is presented and provided in more comfortable and more palatable ways that you have to take advantage of. I like Tim Wise. Tim Wise has been to campus. Tim Wise says what everybody else says, but it's more palatable because he's white, talking largely to white folks, as opposed to me being black and saying it.
But do you have so this is my friend never knows how to answer this for me, but I'm starting to have a real problem with white people getting rich off of talking anti-racism while we're living it. I don't know how to fix that. I don't know what, I think about white fragility. I think about Tim Wise. And so here are these white people going around getting famous and making money doing anti-racism stuff while we're the ones who are living through it.
Yeah.
I don't know how to fix that, but.
If there were more, I would be equally upset, but somebody has to do it. I would rather somebody step up and present, not to discredit what they do, but to present as an ally and to suggest it, because there really aren't enough. I mean, one of the reasons they're getting rich is because there are so few people that do it.
Yeah.
I mean, we can't.
I mean, black people we've been writing and talking about this for years.
I know. The rich part of it, I have a problem with that, but there aren't enough to, they inevitably they have to get rich because there aren't enough people that are demonstrating that skill set, right? I mean, in the spirit of capitalism, you kind of go, if there were a bunch of people, that money would be redistributed to all the people that can do it, but because there are 3 or 4 people that have been nationally specialized in the field of being white and talking about white fragility and talking about racism, they are directly and indirectly reaping the benefits of it.
I just think about
nobody doing it.
True, but I just think about the 3 of us who are not. I mean, I know the
Not
2 of you
rich.
are making big salaries,
Yeah.
but I just think about all the work we've been doing, and we're not on speaking tours and having people talk about. But anyway, that's a whole separate conversation.
Yeah. Well, and I would add to that, they're not talking about anything that's new either. So that, I mean, then you talk about getting rich and speaking, they're not describing anything, they're not revealing anything, they're not presenting a new knowledge necessarily.
Sure.
They're just kind of restating the obvious. So
Yeah.
getting rich for restating the obvious, which is problematic on another level.
Yeah.
in which you probably in your graduate education was told, well, what are you adding new to the body of knowledge? And was probably negatively impacted by those statements.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, I think, in terms of when it does make people uncomfortable and they're not a minoritized person, I think in general, whenever it makes someone uncomfortable, it's because it presents a worldview that challenges what they're used to, right? So if you're a white person that's been raised in the United States, that has been kind of taught this one narrow history of what the United States is and what it means, to be the land of the free and the home of the brave, when there's information that's presented to you that counteracts that narrative, one of the reactions can be to be uncomfortable with it, right? And to immediately reject it. And so when that happens, a reaction is being uncomfortable, right? And so the same thing is when anyone is presented with an alternative idea, the initial reaction can be to be uncomfortable, to say, no, I don't want to do this. Or people have been socialized to say, talking about race is racist, right? And so if you talk about race, then you're being racist. The way to get rid of racism is to not talk about it. And so then it makes people, the idea that race is even brought up, it's like, well, if you're making race an issue by mentioning it, if you didn't mention it, then it wouldn't be an issue. And then this goes across issues of gender, sexual orientation, all of these kinds of things, right? And so I think that why are people uncomfortable? Because it represents a shift in a worldview that maybe for certain people in their lives, they haven't had to shift their worldview very often. And particularly, like Scott, when you were talking about people who are raised in like segregated, homogenous places, right? This happens often. That was my big thing coming to Texas with religion. Like Christianity's so normalized here, right? And that was a big change from California, right? And it wasn't until when I came here, I was like, whoa, like this is just taken for granted here that everybody's Christian, right? And so if you bring up religion, it makes people uncomfortable, right? Because they don't know how to talk about religious differences because they haven't had very much practice thinking about what are some alternative worldviews and what does it mean to be inclusive in this way, right? And so I think that so when I teach classes about race and racism, I'm teaching one right now, well, the first thing we read is like out of Micah Pollock has an edited book called like Everyday Anti-Racism. And one of the chapters is like Courageous Conversations, which is a shorter version of a larger book. And they talk about like 4 like agreements or 4 things you should expect to have courageous conversations. And one of them is to expect to experience discomfort. And they talk about how that discomfort can vary depending on your positionality. And I find naming it is helpful because then everyone realizes that it's normal, right, to experience that.
Well, what is the role of an institution of higher learning in helping our nation address this current challenge? We're at an institution of higher learning.
I would say broadly speaking, I think it is to prepare students to enter a multicultural space. That, I mean, whether you're talking about race, class, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, ability, whatever it may be, it's thinking about these macro and micro level ways that you can best prepare our students to interact socially, to be true leaders, if that's the hope, right? I mean, if you're saying, hey, you're coming here to get a bachelor's degree or an advanced degree, and you're going to be some 30% of the population that holds that privilege of having a college education, not only should you sound like that in terms of your discipline, but you should sound like that in terms of just being a human being. And, so for me to tell gay jokes with a bachelor's degree, or to tell sexist jokes with a bachelor's degree, shows or demonstrates that you didn't get what you needed when you were at whatever university it is that you were at. And so I think that broadly speaking, I think the foundation should be, are we preparing you to go out into this world, especially in the current kind of cancel culture? Folks are white folks are losing their jobs. They're losing their jobs for saying stupid things, for doing stupid things, for racist. stupid things. And so even to look and say, we're having this conversation so that you can keep your job, keep your stability, keep your livelihood. When I teach race and crime, I tell the students that if you're a police officer and you're in this class, or you want to be a police officer, my goal of you coming out of this class is for you to not end up on the news. To not have done something racially or ethnically or class-based or sexual orientation-based that lands you on the news or lands you in hot water being fired. You know, we will have talked about all of that over the course of the semester. Now, if you leave and you just say, hey, you know, that was interesting, but I don't care, I'm gonna keep treating people the way I treat them, you know, that you can't control, but you have to be able to come away with a knowledge that, hey, I'm going to have to interact with people that don't look like me and don't come from where I come from, and don't have backgrounds in what I have, but I need to be able to meet them where they are.
Yeah,
You know,
I agree with you, Scott, and I'm thinking about the football players at the University of Texas. I'm thinking about Deshaun Watson out of Clemson. I'm thinking about, so I did my undergrad at the University of Iowa, so I was interested in what happened with the football team at the University of Iowa. But I'm glad, I'm not sure this is answering your question, Valerie, that I'm really glad that so many Black athletes are using their platform and their space to speak out against white supremacy. I'm still wondering what's going to happen with the basketball coach here, and I hope that it's dealt with in a way that is satisfactory to all parties involved. But I do hope that there is a day of reckoning that white coaches can't continue to treat Black men, and I just because I'm talking about football players, using them to make all this money and then expecting them to be silent. And I liked what the Iowa football player said, which is, if you only want to come and watch me play on Saturday, don't come. You know, I'd rather have 1,000 people in the stand cheering for me than 70,000 people, and the rest of you, when I go out into the community, you don't want to be bothered with me. So I'm glad that higher education athletics is being used as a space to try to change how people are treated on campus. And I have other stuff I can talk about, but Manica, it's your turn.
I think I see it at two levels. I think institutionally, higher education, like within itself, an institution of higher learning needs to not reproduce like racism, sexism, you know, transphobia, all those intersections. So thinking about how the systems within itself are supportive of students and are, even before you get to the level of classes, is like what is happening on campus and how are things functioning? How do they function to marginalize or to support, you know? And so I think that one of the things that really has to kind of come into play in this whole conversation is institutions of higher education really acknowledging how they're complicit in racism, how they're complicit in all of these things, and really being open about it, and then being willing to do the work and not necessarily putting that work on Black faculty or other faculty of color, but thinking about institutionally, people who are in positions of power, what systemic changes are they making that have direct impact on students, staff, you know, faculty members and things like that. So I think there's one sense of like the institution as a model for what, you know, an anti-racist institution could look like. So I think that's one thing we could do. And then also I think producing, I think a lot has to come down to what's in the curriculum. I think that if someone is able to go through a program, I often think of, speaking of Iowa, Stephen King, right? Senator, representative from Iowa,
Yeah.
when he, among many other racist things, xenophobic things he said too, he talked about how like basically white people are the only people who contributed anything to civilization. But what really stuck out to me about his comment is that that idea is a reflection of our school system, right? And so I think in higher education, if based on what people are being taught in school, what are they expected to graduate knowing and doing? Do they, you know, graduate never having been introduced to ideas that challenge racist beliefs, that challenge, homophobic beliefs, and not because, universities are liberal institutions trying to like brainwash people, right? But that the idea is that we value the humanity of people, right? And that we value people's individual autonomy, and that you want to produce people who will respect individuals and respect communities, right? And so I think sometimes the language of individual freedom gets taken up as a way to disrespect communities, but individuals are what kind of make communities. And so I think that if your students need to be able to understand the people who they're going to work with in the future as being both humans, and recognize their humanity, and as well as recognize the people that they're connected to in communities.
I really, really hate to interrupt this conversation. I think we're going to need to meet again at some time so we can keep this conversation going. I know a couple of you have mentioned that I could say more, but I'll stop. I think we really need to keep this conversation going. But I think right now, let's take some questions from our audience. If you have questions, audience, please type them in the question and answer box below your controls, and I will read those questions, and each of our panelists will take an opportunity to answer them. Okay, I see your questions coming in. Thank you so much. There are a lot of questions, and we will get to as many of those as we can in our allotted time. I want to introduce a final panelist that will be joining us today for the live question and answer session. Joining us today, we have Dr. Marcus Johnson, Assistant Professor of Curriculum and Instruction in the College of Education. Dr. Johnson has research expertise in elementary education, social studies, early childhood education, African American education, teacher education, and sociology of education. He is the author of several critically acclaimed articles, including Trump, Kaepernick, and MLK as Maybe Citizens, Early Elementary African American Males Analysis of Citizenship, and also Troubling the Waters, a critical essay on Black male role models and mentors. Thank you for each of the panelists for being with us today. Dr. Johnson, the first question today is for you. Whose responsibility is it to tackle the issue of racism in America? And how do we tackle this issue?
Wow, that is a loaded question that could take half of this panel. But I would say to those who are incurring the wrath of it, those are the first people who should speak up and do something. So experience has taught me not to look outside of myself and those who identify as a collective, to look to those to help out. So I think one is to galvanize yourself individually, as well as those who have a common mindset or identity to fight this oppression. And I think at the end of the day, any morally inclined person should want to fight against racism. This is something that the line should be drawn about. So I think anyone who is about making this life, making society more just, should be the not only the ones that are fighting, but the ones who should benefit from it. And I will also say how we go about that. I am in favor of the full spectrum and range, from those praying to those of self-defense. And I think in any war that, and trust me, this is an anti-Black war that I'm fighting and that I'm seeing. In any war, there are certain divisions, right? You have the Green Berets, you have the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. So I think in multiple areas, we're all fighting this, whether it be through education, through economics, through health. All of these activities, all of these human activities require our efforts and our energy. So in any method, I have no problem with people, again, from praying to self-defense. I feel all is warranted.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Dr. Brooks, the next question is for you. How does early education play a role in perpetuating racism?
Well, I think it happens on multiple levels. I think, again, going back to talking about the curriculum, what stories are included in the curriculum and what stories are not included in the curriculum. So education can be a way of reinforcing stereotypes. And sometimes it can be, I think, it's not that people are necessarily actively teaching stereotypes, but the silence themselves around providing any alternative narratives, right, reinforce the stereotypes that people already come with. So if you came from a family that said the only people that contribute anything substantial to society is white people, and then you go to school and all you learn about are also that white people contributed meaningful things to society, what else are you to take from that situation? Another way it happens is through, I think, the fact that our schools are very segregated. And so literally not interacting with people that are different than you, not having the experiences of being in communication with people. And then oftentimes the leadership structures in schools, if you look at who are paraprofessionals and custodians and their racial backgrounds versus people who are in leadership of schools, who are teachers, I think that reinforces to children who are professionals and who are not. And those are often, if you look at the statistics, very racialized positions that reflect the larger discrimination that's happening in our society.
Dr. Bowman, can you address this next question for us? In combating racism, why is it important for white people to acknowledge their privilege?
It's essential to acknowledge privilege, especially from a historical perspective, because that is, in many ways, the foundation of the construction of America, right? So the economic advantage of slavery, the economic advantage of coming back from World War II and having the opportunity to gain federally funded housing that was essentially segregated, and the benefits that are associated with that. Borrowing money to pay for college education, borrowing money to start businesses, creating a space where policing looks very different. Those are fundamental privileges, and acknowledging that, I think, not only allows for the opportunity for individuals to understand and have a better sense of how they arrived at where they arrived, but also to do so without blaming necessarily, or without saying, hey, the kind of question where you get my ancestors did this, what does this have to do with me? And it's like, well, part of that answer is that you continue to reap the benefits of privilege associated with it, and at least at a minimum, understanding that and recognizing that and having a willingness to fight against that is paramount to moving forward. I mean, if you don't recognize that privilege and these larger privileges, it makes it very difficult to understand, even at the university level, it makes it very difficult to understand contemporary criminal justice, contemporary nursing, contemporary education, contemporary history. And so, it's key, it's paramount to understanding it. Privilege, I believe, is an excellent place to start a conversation that kind of brings people together and understanding, hey, it's not because I'm Black, it's not because you're Latino, it's not because of whatever, it's really because there are certain advantages that are invisible, to borrow from Peggy McIntosh, that you're carrying in this invisible knapsack, that are awarding you opportunities and benefits and access to public spaces and private spaces, probably more importantly, that you may not even consider and you may not even realize, and you may not even stop to look around to say who's excluded here, who's not here, and why are they not here? And is it just because of a lack of work ethic or laziness or some of the old stereotypes and descriptives that are used for people of color, poor white folks, et cetera? And so it's paramount to bring privilege into the conversation.
Dr. Goldstone, this next question is for you. A viewer wrote, being a Black woman, I understand that we have had plenty of these wake-up calls and attempts to change what we are currently undergoing. Why do you believe our concerns of equality, equity have been disregarded?
That's a really good question.
Hey, see, Mom, we go.
Papa and Nan said,
Can you hear me? I hear Dwight in the background. I think that's a really good question. When I think I want to answer it more, the way I want to think about it is, why is this time seem to be the catalyst that's made people take it more seriously? And I think for the first time, white people and Black people are having a conversation, and white people are actually listening. I think Black people have been having this conversation amongst ourselves for years. As Scott mentioned, when Rodney King happened, we thought that maybe this would be the end, and it wasn't. And I think finally white people are stopping and looking and can no longer turn away to the stories we've been sharing amongst ourselves, and are finally taking the opportunity to learn. I noticed one of the questions is what could Black people do to help white people? And I think white people need to, they need to fix this. And while we're there to help, I don't think this is our burden to fix. Anyway, that was a long answer, so I'm gonna let you ask another question.
Well, Dr. Johnson, can you address this question? One viewer would like to know, how should we talk to white friends and family who minimalize or ignore the racism Black people face? People who believe Black people do not face racism anymore.
There we go. Okay, I would say that sometimes it depends, because it does wear on you. And for instance, there have been certain times during my undergraduate and graduate school experiences where I didn't even go to class during, I remember one time the day after Mike Brown was assassinated, I didn't even go to class because I knew I was gonna, my humanity was gonna overwhelm my professionality at that point, right? And so I think it's incumbent on you to know where you are mentally, spiritually, physically, to be in a good space to even have a conversation like this, because a lot of people take for granted the violence that's associated with racism. This isn't something that we just talk about. This is something that we experience. And so I think it's incumbent on you to know that even if you're in a good space to have that conversation, and if you are, I think one of the best things is to keep it 100, to keep it real. And part of that is not withholding how you feel. It's having a real dialogue, having a real conversation, removing some of the buffers and the things that would protect someone's feelings, and just removing the veneer off this and having an authentic conversation about, this is how I feel, this is how I feel we should move forward. So I think authenticity, truth, and being genuine is incumbent upon these conversations.
Thank you. Dr. Brooks, this question is for you. Can you please give advice to a white professor on how to demonstrate support for an African-American student in class when discussing racial issues without singling the student out or making the person feel even more stigmatized?
Well, I think that it needs to start before the actual conversation happens, right? So it's talking about setting norms in the classroom ahead of time for communication. So I think sometimes we just say, like, okay, now we're going to talk about racism. We're going to talk about this without having established a culture in our classroom. So I think before you even get to the topic, beginning of the year, throughout all of this conversation, I think you need to develop clear guidelines for communication. You need to show that student in the way that you handle responses to other topics that you're a trustworthy person, that you know how to navigate these types of conversations. And I think if you develop strong interpersonal relationships, and you don't need to necessarily single that person out, because your actions from the beginning all throughout the class will demonstrate, what kind of person you are. So I always tell my students, like whenever in class, I'm like, right now you have no reason to trust me. You have no reason to think that if you say something that I'm going to react in certain ways, but I hope that you see in my actions over the course of this semester the type of person I am, and that it influences the literature that I select, the way that I engage with students. And I think by doing that, you create the groundwork for communication to happen. I think sometimes being like, oh, there is like this Black person in my class, how can I support them, is the wrong way to think about it. It's how do I create an anti-racist environment in which people who are marginalized along different axes can feel comfortable. And in this context, in relationship to Blackness, I'm going to be particularly aware of the needs of this student, right? Thank you. That's such a good question.
Dr. Bowman, this question will be for you. This particular viewer wants to know, what specific unjust policies should we target to change at the university, in the San Marcos community, in Texas, and in the US to slowly dismantle systemic racism? I know that's a big question. Dr. Goldstone, I'd also like for you to respond to it as well. So Dr. Bowman first, and then Dr. Goldstone.
They didn't want to know about the world. I mean, it's the US and Texas, and that is difficult. That is difficult. I think the easy answer, and I'm going to go with the kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs response, and I'm going to say that those policies and practices that are of a life and death nature should be first and foremost. I think policing, which we've talked about quite a bit, the use of force, deadly use of force by police, and the disproportionalities associated should be addressed. The disproportionality of childbirth for African American and Latino women should be addressed immediately. I think anything that has to do with life and death, first and foremost, or the potential or the disproportionate outcomes that are producing death, should be at any level for any group under any circumstances, should be first and foremost. I think once we get to the basic level playing field of everyone has an equal opportunity to live and live abundantly, then we can start talking about other things. But I think anything that's life and death is the starting point. Thank you.
I'm going to agree with Scott on that one. I think about, so the last year I was in Tennessee, I spent one evening a month teaching in a men's prison, and it really helped me to see the inequities, not just inside but outside, and what they would face when they got out. So I agree with Scott that policing, I think I'm starting to be like Angela Davis, and I think we need to just abolish the prison system and find another way to address the laws, and I put that in quotes. I think some people are in prison who have no business being there. So I'm just going to echo what Scott said.
Dr. Johnson, one viewer writes, "It shocks me how much was held from me during my education and how misconceived a lot of my notions about this country were. Seems to me education is such a massive part of this movement. What do you see as the largest roadblock to education reform in this country, with more focus on the non-whitewashed version of American history?"
There is a scholar, Lowenthal, that states that history and social studies disguises itself as what we should learn, but reveals itself as who we should become. And I think in many ways we buffer again, right? We even when it goes back to the question that Dr. Brooks answered earlier with early childhood, Many times we think of something being controversial as being inappropriate for kids, or being age appropriate might be an issue. But I think in many ways, people understand that if children were taught real history, if children were truly educated, what's happening right now would have happened years ago. Because what we're seeing right now is, I believe in many ways, is the veil being sort of removed from many young people who came up with Barack Obama as the president, who were taught that many of the issues of racism were somehow just dismissed after 8 years of being in office, and that was something that was in the past, just like the civil rights was something in the past, just like Jim Crow, just like slavery, right? But in many ways, we're seeing that because of the miseducation, people are lied to. One of the prominent works that I read about, Lies My Teacher Told Me, talks about this, how the curriculum flat out lies about origins and identities and even experiences. So if we are to truly educate the young people that are coming up, I think one of the ways that we can educate each other is to listen to the students' experiences. In many ways, that's something that is totally left out of curriculum. In many ways, it is a one-way road where we tell, it's the banking model that Paulo Freire talks about, right? Where you just deposit information into a kid's mind and they regurgitate it. But many times that education doesn't come the other way, because all of these policies and practices and laws that we are discussing are affecting the youth, but they have very little voice in what they're actually learning. So one thing that I think that is crucial is implementing more student voice in what they are learning, more community voice in what they are learning. One documentary, Precious Knowledge, that covers the ethnic studies in Arizona in the mid-2000s, was talking about how we know that the school is in the community, but is the community in the school? And I think that's an incredible thing to think about when it comes to curriculum.
This final question will be for Dr. Brooks. Dr. Brooks, in your role as Black faculty, how do you balance the need for self-care and challenging the status quo? What would you like to share with faculty who benefit from the status quo?
And that's a really hard question to answer because I'm really bad at self-care. So that's why I'm pausing so long. I think you could say also, I want to say, I don't want to attribute the quote to the wrong person, but I think it's Zora Neale Hurston who said, like, I want to say it's Zora Neale Hurston. She said that, like, you know, if you're silent, they'll kill you and say that you liked it or something like that. And so that's kind of my philosophy, is that, like, when I hold what I'm feeling and my experiences or the things that I see happen to other people inside of me, I start, like, it impacts me emotionally and physically. So I have to say something, because I wouldn't feel good knowing that I saw injustice happen, or that I participated in it, or that something was happening to me and I remained silent or complacent just to get by. Like, that's not who I am as a person. And at times that means that I have to, you know, speak out and say things and take that risk, you know, and and because I do that on top of, like, teaching and also do my research. And then also sometimes, because students know that I'm passionate about things like this, then also students just come to me individually to talk to me about things that they're experiencing, or maybe other faculty members come talk to me too. And so it ends up being, like, it can be a lot of pressure sometimes. And so I think, in thinking about navigating all those, I think what I would like to see from faculty members who are not experienced. So, for example, if you're a non-Black Latino or Latinx person and you see anti-Blackness, to speak on it, right? You know, so, like, and if you are, you know, if you're someone who's Black and not an immigrant, you know, to speak on xenophobia, for you know, cisgender people to speak on stuff that they see happening to trans people. And I think being able to, I think being an accomplice or an ally or whatever is speaking when you get no benefit from it, and not speaking in a way of speaking over or speaking for people, but calling attention to the injustice rather than always having the people in the community who are suffering the injustice have to do it. And then maybe in the background being like, oh, I really agreed with you. You did such a good job. But then in public, never being like, hey, this is wrong and this is unacceptable. Because oftentimes when you speak about your experience being a member of a marginalized group, people will say, oh, well, she just has a chip on her shoulder, or this is why she's upset about these things. There is privilege given to the people who are not dealing with the issue as somehow they can be more objective, which is not true, but that's how it's perceived. And so I think to really sit with the moments that you see injustice and you're silent because it doesn't directly impact you, and then to think about why in that moment you chose to coach yourself in your privilege instead of saying like, hey, this is wrong. And then beyond saying this is wrong, what active steps are you taking to push institutions or people to change? Because I am, like, for example, as someone who's Black, I'm not a part of conversations that white people have amongst themselves, right? And so the only way that like people can push back on stuff like that is in conversations that I'm not a part of, right? And so I think those are the ways that I think about it. Now, self-care, I try, but you know, reality television, a lot of reality television, I guess, is my, my other kind of self-care.
Well, our time is starting to wind down. I think this is a conversation that will need to continue to be an ongoing conversation. I'm so sorry we were not able to get to all of the questions. Just the sheer number of them prevented us from being able to get them. Panelists, I may be reaching out to you for some additional answers. I don't know how we will be able to convey that. I'll work with Dr. Ben and somehow and figure out how we can do that. But thank you to each of you for your wisdom and your insight. As we close out on our time, I just want to thank you very much for your time. I also want to thank the members of the audience who took the time to contribute such thought-provoking questions. At the beginning of our panel today, I opened the panel with a Dr. Du Bois quote. So it's fitting that I also end today's panel and question and answer with a quote from Dr. Du Bois. In his 1905 Niagara Movement speech, Dr. Du Bois said, either the United States will destroy ignorance or ignorance will destroy the United States. Again, let's keep this conversation going, Bobcats. Let's be the leaders that the world needs right now at this moment to destroy ignorance. Thank you very much for spending your time with us today. Back to you, Dr. Ben.
All right, thank you so much to our faculty panel for that very open and candid discussion. So something the panel got me to thinking about is a mantra that the People's Institute asserts, and that is this: racism was created and learned. Therefore, it can be dismantled and unlearned. And additionally, that whole discussion about policy, I think is something that's really important, because policies can be racist and they can be anti-racist. And something that Ibram X. Kendi talks about in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is this very issue of policies, right? And he talks about dismantling racism through anti-racist practices, policies, and systems. And so here's something that he says in the book. This is something that he writes in How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I highly recommend. I thought of racism as an inanimate, invisible, immortal system, not as a living, recognizable, mortal disease of cancer cells that we could identify and treat and kill. He goes on to say that separating the overt individual from the covert institutional veils the specific policy choices that cause racial inequities, policies made by specifically policies made by specific people. Covering up the specific policies and policy makers and policies, covering up the specific policies and policy makers as we lash out angrily at the abstract boogeyman of a system. In the way investigators can figure out exactly, and did, figure out exactly who those church bombers were who killed the 4 Black elementary school girls in 1963. He says investigators can figure out exactly what policies cause 500 Black babies to die each year, and exactly what policies cause them and who put those policies in place. And the way people have learned to see racist abuse coming out of the mouths of individual racists, people can learn to see racial inequities emerging from racist policies. All forms of racism are overt if our anti-racist eyes are open to seeing racist policy in racial inequity. All right, and here's a thought. We, Texas State, have the ability and a responsibility to work to co-create with our students, which is something Dr. Johnson reminded us of, to create the kind of racially just society and learning community that they need and that we want to be a part of and to take part in. So Asante, thank you to the committee. I'm sorry, to the panelists. So as we move into our reflective lunch hour, we invite you to grab your lunch and join us as we take this time to contemplate on the experiences of a group of individuals that disproportionately bear a unique burden of the tax that is exacted by racism, and that is Black men in America. So what you will be presented during this reflective lunch session is a montage of videos that highlight some of the experiences of Black men. And I would implore you to allow this session to spark your critical thinking and introspective insights regarding experiences which you may not be intimately familiar or have knowledge of. The montage of films will begin with a new production entitled Dear Bruh, a eulogy, a baptism, a call to action. Dear Bruh was produced by Dr. Yaki Smith, an up-and-coming screenwriter who is Associate Professor of Film and Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Moody College of Communications at UT Austin. I want to thank Dr. Skylar Walks for connecting me with his work. Asante Sana, thank you very much. Here's something else to consider. These are the experiences of some of your students, your classmates, your colleagues, friends, and family members. So allow your heart to be touched and your call to action to be ignited.
Dear bruh, I miss you more than ever today. I already mourn losing you, but today, for some strange reason,